Hello. Okay, our numbers are edging up, so we'll just give it a minute and then we will begin.
This is like one of those moments where you always want like a little bit of music playing, but no one ever does it. Like, I don't know why we don't have.
I don't sing well, otherwise I could
One of you all sing.
something.
I feel like the theme song should be Human Nature.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we can begin. Someone says, good call on the theme song.
Nice.
So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Connector series sponsored by Juno Search Partners. I am your host today, Melinda Ramos, VP, Director of Talent and Diversity at Brownstein Group, an advertising and PR agency here in Philadelphia. I identify as she and her. I'm a cis woman, Latinx descent, also heterosexual. And I would like to welcome you today to our talk on microaggressions in the workplace. I expect this to be a very interesting conversation today, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'll start first with Kia Christian, Global HR Leader at Google. Kia, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns and how you identify?
Sure, Melinda, happy to be here with everyone. As you mentioned, I am an HR leader with Google currently. I've spent, about 25 years, both in HR and business roles globally. Currently in California, but originally from Philadelphia. So really thrilled to be here with Juno and the team. I identify as a cisgender Black woman, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Excellent. Thank you so much and welcome. I'm happy to be here with you. Next up, we have Natalie Egan, founder and CEO of Translator. Natalie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, including how you identify and your pronouns?
So hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Egan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm the CEO and founder of Translator, where we build diversity and inclusion analytics software for corporations, schools, and nonprofits. In terms of how I identify, I think, first and foremost, I identify as human. I also identify as a mom. I identify as an entrepreneur. I also identify as a runner. I also happen to be transgender, so I identify as a white transgender woman. I'm able-bodied for the most part, and just very privileged and honored to be here today with you all. So thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this really important conversation.
Thank you, Natalie, and welcome. And last but not least, we have Michael O'Brien, founder of Human Nature. Welcome, Michael. Tell us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns and how you identify.
So yeah, great to be here. Great to be amongst a really great panel of folks. I am the founder of a consultancy that works with nonprofits, businesses, local government agencies, and their employees to transform how they understand and support human development and interaction and performance, particularly focused on organizational culture in the workplace. A lot of expectations there that don't necessarily have the right inputs for the desired outputs. And we don't know how to often focus on the humanity of individuals in the workplace to best set them up to do what we are hoping they can deliver on our behalf as organizations. So the consultancy sits in that space. And then I'm also a fellow at a space called the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation, a think tank out of Drexel University that really focuses on metro economies and city building, urbanism. And my work, as you heard, I try to focus on like the human sciences around best performance and also just like best case environments for development, right? Yeah, that's me. Oh, my pronouns and all that. So I identify as a Black man, as a cis Black man, but also as a queer Black man. And my pronouns are he and him. And I also identify as an artist. My undergrad is in music, and I love art, and I will never let that go.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you so much and welcome. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. And again, we're talking about microaggressions in the workplace. And I want to start off by saying what I hope to get out of this conversation today is confronting our own implicit bias and how it impacts our interactions with others, how language impacts interactions, and really allowing ourselves to sit in the discomfort and learn how to be better humans, be better partners, employees, just better all around. So that's what I'm hoping to get out of this conversation. I want to turn it over to you and ask you what your personal point of view is on what microaggressions are based on your individual experiences and how it manifests itself for you. I'll start first by saying I've heard it described as death by 1,000 cuts. And I believe that to be 100% true. And for me personally, I would describe it as a slow and prolonged soul crushing, really having devastating effects on an individual's long-term psyche. And so I'm going to turn it over to Natalie. Natalie, why don't you tell us what your point of view is on it?
Sure. So thanks. Really, really glad that we're having this conversation in particular at this time, because I think, microaggressions are this sort of universal part of how we exist in the world, but it's something we don't realize we're doing. It's sort of a part of unconscious bias, but it's like the output, right? And it's these everyday subtle interactions that we, and behaviors that we unconsciously and sometimes consciously do, but don't understand the impact, right? So sometimes our intent is good, but the impact is very negative. And, I'm really glad you brought up this topic that, everything really happens through language. So microaggressions happen through language, right? And language is not just what we're saying, but it's our body language, right? It's the things that we write, right? There's all kinds of ways that we interact with language every day, and microaggressions can show up through all of it. And again, it's oftentimes unconscious. We don't realize it's happening, but the impact can be devastating. And as a trans woman, I feel them every single day, right? I mean, I cannot navigate any spaces without feeling, microaggressions, whether it's coming through the media and, I open up my phone in the morning and the first thing I'm seeing on my phone, or it's like, it's on, I'm always feel like I'm on blast. And what's really interesting is prior to my transition, I would have never been able to even understand this concept, as a person who prior to my transition, at least to the world, identified as a very masculine, sort of alpha presenting white male. I navigated the world without having to think about my identity, without having to think about other people's experience of me. I was sort of unconscious in that capacity, mostly because of my repressed identity. But I was a incredible perpetrator of microaggressions. And prior to my transition, I ran another company in Philadelphia called People Links, which was a B2B enterprise software company. And just the short story is our employer brand was toxic masculinity, right? Like it was intentional. That's what we were being rewarded for it by the venture capital firms. And, I did a lot of microaggressions. I had no idea what I was doing. And one of the most interesting things I learned since I had transitioned was that there was this one thing I did every day, and I'm just gonna be very honest with you all about this, but every day when I came into the office, which was mostly white men, and we had one Black woman working for us, and she was the sort of admin office manager for the whole organization. But every morning I would walk in and I would pat her on the head as I walked by her, and she would laugh, and it was like this joke thing that I thought we had this really good relationship, and I thought it was this way of me connecting with her. And I never realized like how traumatic that can be for people. And she was never going to say anything to me about it because I was the CEO of the company, and there was just all this sort of power dynamics in place that prevented her from ever being able to say anything about it. And I'm really so sorry for what I did, but I also realized that we all have our unconscious way of being in the world. And the call to action for people, I think, here today in this conversation is just to kind of really step back from what we're doing and think about our intent versus our impact and how that's affecting people around us, and really strive to be open and do better.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure the understanding the privileges that you experienced prior to your transition and now what your experience is sort of vastly different, really kind of opens up your point of view on the topic. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. I'd like to move on to Kia. What do you think? How would you explain it?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what both you and Natalie have described in many ways. I think they tend to be subtle slights that compound over time. I think in a work environment, people often forget that you had a career and you've had experiences prior to showing up in whatever current organization you work for. And so that compounding of these daily microaggressions, these slights, these cuts, they build up over time, and they absolutely perpetuate systemic bias within an organization. They can break down, your self-worth, how you view yourself. People walk away sometimes feeling like, am I crazy? Am I losing? And no one else sees this. No one else heard this. And you can sometimes start to push them aside yourself and cast them as, no, I'm super sensitive, or I'm the only one seeing this, so my interpretation, my experience must be invalid. But the reality is microaggressions come in many forms, and they can be super public. They can be one-on-one, as Natalie described, a one-on-one interaction. The intent may not be there, but the harm can be super deep. And I think it is difficult depending on the relationship that you have with someone that you're experiencing a microaggression from as well. And we can get into that discussion around how you address those. But I think for someone who from birth has been born a Black woman in America, I also have a very mixed race family. And so I've had microaggressions from the perspective of people making assumptions about me, about my family, about our background. Very surprised to see the relation for some of us and the connectivity. And because of how we present or how we look physically. I think the other piece of microaggressions is that sometimes you can experience microaggression among friends. And so a friend that you care very deeply about and cares very deeply about you can also be quite hurtful in the way that they engage. Again, I think that the severity of microaggressions goes unacknowledged a lot of time. And even when it is acknowledged, it can be quickly dismissed with a quick apology. But not really understanding why that was so hurtful and why that added to probably, a lifetime for many people of experiences of microaggressions every day, all day, and every interaction. Imagine being someone who, from the time that you wake up, as Natalie said, you're looking on your phone, you're looking at news, to the time that you go to bed. It could be a last, exchange with a neighbor before you go into your house for the night. Microaggressions all day long. And what that does to someone's mental well-being and even your physical health as that built up over time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Michael, why don't you talk to us a little bit about your point of view on the topic?
Yeah, so phrased beautifully already by my two co-panelists, so I'll just build on what they've said because I agree with everything there. So just to add some more nuance, I think Natalie's framing around implicit bias being the driver and the microaggression being an outcome or an output is really important because, and the framing around owning the harm, right? And understanding that your intention and the harm that's created are technically two separate things, right? And in that context, it's important that we set some I like science a lot, so we set some scientific parameters around bias. There's this, and I mean this lovingly, but there's this almost like car salesman-like vibe right now, the DEI training and bias training. And there's this phrase of know your biases. You got to know all your own biases. And I just sit back as a man of science and go, that like it's unconscious, it's implicit, it's inherently unknowable to the fullest degree. That does not absolve you from the responsibility of making sure that you're not creating harm, even if it's unintentional. But the idea that you're going to be able to address said harm or potential harmful activities by doing a deep index of all of your biases and then going, check, box done, I know them all, like that's a faulty premise. So first we gotta all understand that, right? And then we need to understand a second bucket that's, we all have both implicit and explicit or unconscious and conscious biases. It's a part of the human survival mechanism and endeavor. So to act as if you're above that, or I don't have that, or that's not my issue, that means you're not human. So like, I think let's be clear on what we're talking about, that this is a part of a survival mechanism and index that has a lot more to do with our species 100,000 years ago than it actually does today in terms of survival, but it's actually primed to operate quickly, fast, and again, it's unconscious. It's gonna operate under your general understanding of whatever moment you're in. And bias is not just about race. There are things, there are constructs like confirmation bias, which are also at play. So you're also going to feel justified and right to be making that kind of comment or to be doing a kind of thing, because back to something Natalie said, which I really appreciated, a lot of it comes sometimes with the goal of building relationship. And you don't know how to do that because you've actually not invested in understanding the humanity of the other person. You're actually sitting in the socialized ways that you've been, you know, cultured to then try to connect with this person. And you're gonna try through some weird way that feels right because it's the thing that makes the most sense to you, and confirmation bias is lining you up for that. And then you do it and you're like, I think that was good, yeah. And you walk away feeling good. And because of power dynamics and the whole nine, people are left in spaces and places where, to Kia's point, they're having to question themselves. We're being gaslit internally, externally. And then it makes for this positionality where when it's required of me to perform in the workplace, I now have what I like to call invisible landmines, psychosocial or psychological landmines thrown all throughout the environment of my workplace that literally can disrupt my performance, can disrupt my cognition, can disrupt how I even frame or view a problem, but I'm being expected and demanded to perform at all times. And on the flip side, no one in leadership is responsible for making sure that the design of the organizational culture and the design of the psychosocial environment is built for me to produce what they're asking of me or for my well-being. And I think that's just something that we all have to take into consideration, and that harm and intentionality are two different lanes.
Absolutely. And you've obviously given us a lot to digest, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. I do want to have a bit more of a vulnerable moment with each of you. Natalie, you started by saying that prior to your transition, you exhibited these microaggressive behaviors toward other people. Talk to me about a time that you have experienced it in your life, either the first time you experienced something that you can recall, and what that made you feel.
Yeah, and I would love to say that, like, I don't do it anymore, right? But I like, you know, I'm still, as Michael said, I mean, we still continually do it. I think you can't be aware of it all the time, but you need to, you know, of what they are. But I think the secret is to be aware that it's happening, and you don't know when you're doing it. Like, you really don't know when you're really potentially, you know, creating trauma for somebody, let alone just maybe like insulting them a little bit. So I think it's just this idea of like being open to the fact that it could be happening. And then when somebody confronts you about it, not to be defensive, right? And not say, well, I know that this, you know, you're wrong, right? Or that I've been doing this for years, so it's okay, right? But, you know, listening to other people's lived experiences and getting context is like really the secret to that. And it can like take time, right? And like we, in today's work world, like we oftentimes don't have time to hear everybody's stories. So it can be really challenging. I think that's why these conversations are really valuable. But I think that the probably one of the biggest, it's not like a microaggression, it feels like a macroaggression, right? Where it's like, you know, it's constantly on me is you know, is just being misgendered, right? I mean, and it's not always intentional in the sense that, like, you know, people are using actual wrong pronouns. It's that they're using gendered language that feels very exclusive to me, right? Like, you know, we talked about this beforehand, and, you know, we talked about, like, you know, everything happens through language. So I always have this statement, like, language matters, right? If there's like one thing, like hashtag language matters, right? So we have to be really intentional with our language. And, you know, when we use language loosely, like, again, we don't mean to, but we could be fully excluding whole groups of people. And for me, you know, that language is when people use words like guys, right? So if you know, even on a panel like this, you know, we'll get questions and say, how do you guys handle this issue? And, or I'll be in a conversation with somebody and they'll be like, oh man, like, look at that, you know, whatever, that car, right? And, you know, I don't identify as a man, and they don't mean to be calling me a man. I know what they mean, right? It's an expression for them that they're not necessarily calling me a man, but I hear the word man, and it brings me back to, like, this identity that I've, you know, tried to really get away from, right? Like, it brings me back to my fraternity. Like, you know, people will say things like, dude, you know, check out the, you know, that or whatever. And I'll say something to them, and they'll tell me, like, don't worry about it. Like, don't worry about it. I call my wife dude. And I'm like, I don't care what you call your wife, right? like it's traumatic for me, right? Like, you may have permission to do that in that environment with that person individually, but to make the assumption that that's okay for, like, lots of people is not okay. And oftentimes people will say, like, you know, wait, where do we draw the line here, right? Like, I'll oftentimes be accused of being too sensitive.
Right.
And my argument back is, you're not being sensitive enough, right? Like, especially in the workplace, right? If you want to get the most out of your employees, especially in today's economy and, you know, this sort of talent crisis and all the other crises that are going on, and this new generation of employees that are entering the workplace, like, if you want to get the most out of them, if you want the most employee engagement, the most amount of retention, and you want people to feel seen and heard and represented, you have to slow down. You have to be intentional, and you have to cater towards, you know, their individual needs, because we are all individuals. Like, you know, I think this country was built on, you know, assimilation, right? Capitalism was built on, like, everybody being the same, and this assumption that I can treat all people the same. And those days are long gone, right? I mean, everybody's got cell phones now, everybody's, you know, able to publish, and everybody's got a voice, and everybody can be seen and heard and recognized. And if you don't like it, like, that's like your problem, right? I mean, like, people will move on if they don't feel, like, respected and valued. And, you know, if you want to respect and value me, like, not just use my pronouns correctly, but, like, avoid using words, like, when you're talking to a large group of people, like, don't say, like, you know, we're rolling with the big boys here. Like, that is exclusive language, not just for somebody that's trans, but for most of the women in the room, and some percentage of the people that actually, you know, may identify as male, like, don't like a lot of that language as well, right? So we're making assumptions and those assumptions, you know what assumptions do, right? They make an ass out of you and me, right? So we don't want to make assumptions about our own identities nor about others. And so I know I've given some stories there, but hopefully that was helpful.
No, very, very, very helpful. And I think what's something you said earlier about these words being traumatic for you, and it really speaks to the intent versus the impact of these words, right? We tend to want to defend why we said it, and I didn't intend to say that, and I didn't mean it that way, and, you know, you're too sensitive, but it doesn't recognize the impact that the words can have on an individual and the long-term effects. And so that, I think that's a really important statement to make. So thank you for that. I'd love to hear from Kia if you have an example you want to share with us.
Sure. Like I said, I've got countless examples, but one that comes to mind for me is the over-indexing on a particular person from a marginalized background required to prove themselves over and over again and beyond what you would ask of someone from a majority background. And so I can recall a time in my career where I was working for an organization. I'd been there a few years. Unfortunately, when I was recruited, the story sold to me was different than the reality. And the business leader that I went to work with ultimately said to me, you know, I have to apologize. I wanted you so badly on my team that I sold you the vision of what I wanted this place to be and didn't really give you the inside track of what you were going to have to deal with when you got here in terms of turning things around. And so at that point, I was sort of pushing to get myself back on track from a career perspective in terms of level and scope of role that I belonged in, given my experience. And he eventually moved on to a new role in the organization and later had an opportunity for an HR vice president on his team again. And he said, well, I'd love to have you come work with me. And we had a new head of HR for the organization at the time. I think she had been there about a month or two. And her mandate was to turn around her HR, her senior HR team. In doing so, she had made many appointments of people who were already in the organization. This opportunity came around and the business leader said, hey, raise your hand for it. Would love to work with you. I agreed. Okay, sounds like a great opportunity. You could get me back on track. So I raised my hand for it, reached out to the new head of HR, and she said, oh, you know, great. I've heard so many people, you know, come my way about you and said, we've got to get you, you know, into the right role and scope and responsibility. So let's meet. So great. I'm so excited. I fly up to corporate to meet with her and others. And along the way, I heard, well, this interview process is going to be a little bit different. We've decided now that we're going to interview internal and external candidates. And that there's now this new refreshed job description. So I look at the job description, I met every qualification on there. In fact, some of the core responsibilities, I was the only one in a company of almost 50,000 employees that actually had that experience, had brought it with me and had demonstrated it over the 2 years that I had already been in the organization. So I get to her, she's 25 minutes late for what was scheduled of an hour interview. In the end, she cut the interview short by 15 minutes. And in the window that we had together, she spent the time going on and on and on about how I needed particular HR COE experience, of which I said to her, hey, the first 7 years of my career, I spent in multiple COEs. She continued to try to tick through all of the things I didn't bring. And I asked, hey, have you looked at my resume? And if not, let me hand that to you now. And I'm happy to walk through that. And she pushed the resume aside and said, you know what? I think you're very talented, and I've heard that you're very talented, but I want to see you demonstrate some of these things again while I'm here. And I sort of said to her, and have you asked that of the other people that you've appointed into roles who didn't interview, whom you met and decided that you would just move them into these new roles? And she said, well, no, because I didn't need them to demonstrate anything else for me. And my question was, well, why is that the case for me? Why would this be any different? Well, I understand that you have support from a lot of people in the company, but I've not seen it. And so if you're going to be successful here, you're going to demonstrate this again for us. And then we will decide if we will promote you to X level role. And so that was an example of, again, another opportunity for someone to very, very blatantly, and as Natalie said, it feels almost like a macroaggression, really sort of say to me, the other people who were all white males and men and women, and I'm the only person of color that was moving forward in the process that had raised their hand, that had actually been asked for by the business leader and recommended by others in the company. Yet when it came to me, there was this rigorous process I had to demonstrate over and over again. I already had 15 or more years of experience doing these things. And I felt very justified in my qualifications and readiness for the role. She even had other people say, what's happening here? Like, why would this even be necessary? You couldn't explain it. And the people that she appointed thereafter looked very similar to the ones that she had in place before. So, you know, just an example of where that continues to persist and the bias that creeps in, and what she still couldn't articulate why it was necessary for me to demonstrate above and beyond what anyone else had.
Right. It sounds like you had to contend with multiple microaggressions in that period of time, and you know, the fact that you didn't just, you know, completely go off on this person is surprising, right?
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to. I think I
opportunity there. Yeah.
Yeah. I built up also a resilience, I will say, that sometimes is helpful, not always healthy. But absolutely, I'd learned that keeping my cool, even in those moments, was better for me to, one, continue to gather facts, two, to continue to put the pressure on her to answer these questions. And later allowed me the opportunity to share this story with others to make it known.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Michael.
Yes.
Hi. You're up.
Yeah. You know, it's an interesting question that popped up from Laura Emanuel around elaborating on blind spots and how we can give them attention in a meaningful way. And I think my answer to this can come from that perspective, because I think, particularly as a Black person, he has spoken to a number of the ways that, so researcher Elijah Anderson wrote a book called Code of the Streets. He talks about the discredibility factor that follows Black and brown people. It's like everywhere you go. So I appreciate that a lot, Kia, and you sharing that. I think that, I don't know if you saw the chat box, but a lot of people had some really little responses to that, and I did too. But so to speak to Laura's question and to speak to this idea of something called social geography, which again, I'm a bit of an academic, I'm a practitioner, but I like to be informed by some of the cutting edge inquiries and provocations that then, also try to get data to match our humanity and figure out where the rubs are and where we could be moving forward. I think social geography is a fascinating just framework, because it allows people to think about where do you and your role, positionality, power, privileges, etc., your class status, your gender identity, how are all those things combining for you specifically, right? And what opportunities, advantages, disadvantages, whatever, how do all those things start to play out together? Because on one hand, for me, I'm a Black guy, I'm a queer guy who grew up closeted for a very long time. Long time is relative. I'm 35. So to some people, depending on I'm talking, they're like, oh, you're so young. To other people are like, oh, you're older. But it took a long time for me in terms of the affective journey. It's felt like a very long time to get comfortable enough in my own skin to come out, right? And so being a Black queer guy who grew up poor, but also was able to go to college and blah, blah, blah. And then I've got fellowships. It's a lot of mind-bending stuff to try to figure out in a workplace. And so one of the things that I think my largest, or two areas of large growth, had a lot to do with gender identity and a lot to do and privilege in that space. And the flip side is thinking about what it means to be cis and straight passing. I had people leverage that against me, and I didn't know what that meant. And I was like, "Hell, you mean straight passing?" Because when I in my world, everybody knew I was queer. Mm-hmm. Right? I felt everybody could look at me and were just in their mind were leveraging the nastiest words and comments at me based on that point of identity, right? And so the concept of being straight passing to me, I'm 6'2", broad shouldered, it just wasn't a thing that ever really fully came up, right? Right. And then the flip side, digging into male privilege as a real phenomenon, right? And not and cis male privilege at that as a real phenomenon, and not allowing the oh, it's not that bad, those still small little voices, it's not that bad, but I'm Black, so how can I dip out of this and move around it, because that's a big thing too. And Black people are always having, again, back to that discredibility factor or the hyper-criminalization of Black people, et cetera. That's a thing. But I had to sit in this tension of but you're still a cis man. You identify with the gender that you were assigned with at birth. People are telling you you're straight passing. So even if you don't feel that way, is there harm in interrogating? Well, what does that mean? Why are they saying that? Put a different lens on the situation and start to realize certain things. And a friend of mine said to me, Michael, you get invited to parties I would never get invited to. And that's when I was like, oh, I get it. I get it now, right?
Yeah.
No matter what I feel or think about myself, I get what you're saying. Perception-wise, in many ways, you're right. I do get invited to certain things, or there are seats at the table even made for me around things that I label as like intellectual privilege, right? Because that's the flip side for people of color in particular. We gotta like overly intellectualize sometimes to prove that we have some worth and know a little bit about what we're talking about. But the fact that some of us can actually, go into a traditional academic-like space, whether it's in academia or outside of academia, we can engage with that kind of literature and do that kind of thing. Like that's, to me, that is a form of privilege in itself, because it is a systemic reflection of a very specific kind of intelligence and knowledge that we value because of capitalism, and which automatically connects us to class and levels of access while people are being educated in the whole nine. And we cut off other forms of intelligence and knowing and ways of genius that emerge in the real world. And so being able to maneuver those spaces, like I really had to interrogate that stuff too in the workplace and learn to do things like underscore the women in a meeting. And go like, I actually think Kia brought up a good idea. We should revisit that idea, right? As I hear men just like bypass the ideas coming from women. Or, to Natalie's point around just making sure that I'm practicing the modeling of different language, right? So I do a lot of work in science, as you can tell, and the human sciences at that. And all that language is gendered, mankind. And, so it's like transitioning to humankind, saying folks instead of guys. Like that stuff is really, really important. And I think as a cis man who is also queer and Black and, navigating that kind of social geography, it's also important that I demonstrate to people that even when I'm presenting, when I make those mistakes, I name it for what it is, and then I correct it, right? Immediately. I don't let it slip by, right? I notice it, and I could be embarrassed in that moment and try to just like play it off and blah, blah, blah. Or to your point, Melinda, you sit in the tension, you name the thing like, oh, that's patriarchal, or, oh, that's, sexist, or, oh, that's, X and Y. That's transphobic even, right? Like just name the thing and then say, that is not what I meant. And I apologize if that harmed anybody. Here's what I actually meant. And here's the language that I should be using. And as a cis man, it is important that I take that ownership, because it's not a woman's job to end sexism. It's not trans folks' job and gender nonconforming folks' job to end transphobia. It's not queer people's job to end homophobia, right? Like it's not Black people's job to end racism. Right. It's all of our jobs as humanity to do that, but it's definitely not on the backs of those most impacted and living in those identities who are not in power. We got to be honest, we're not empowered to shape the overarching systemic environment that Kia was describing, she's walking into. So it is, so she can't, even if she wants to flip that entire thing, she actually doesn't have the full power by herself to do it, right? And I think that expectation, and that's why I go back to, end here, going back to social geography, it wasn't until I did all that thinking and had to sit in those tensions that I was like, right, Michael, with your oppressions, you still have privilege, and where in your privilege can you show up on behalf of those who do not have that, that access or that space, or are not even encouraged to use their voice in that way, or given the space even to use their voice in that way.
Right. Yeah, you touched upon a couple of interesting points, and that is one of the most important ones, I think, is using your privilege to help others and to uplift others and help provide a space and give a space for a voice for those people who are oppressed in different ways. And also you each touched a little bit on sort of intersectionality and how that oppression sort of compounds based on what your individual set of circumstances are. And I want to talk a little bit about, you each actually touched upon how the long-term impacts in the workplace. So let's go back to that question and talk about those psychological impacts on work performance and how you've seen it either play out in your respective work environments. And let's talk a little bit about how you might address those issues in the workplace with your leadership, or how you've addressed them in the past. Who wants to go first? Kia, you want to go first? Or
Natalie, I think you were.
But no, I'm just saying I will go first. You can go, Kia.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. So a couple of things. One, I think in the workplace in particular, because of the power dynamics we talked about earlier, like these are like, it's really hard for people to speak up. And what, the ultimate result of that is just, it's like disengagement, right? And people check out, they are just, they don't say anything to anybody about it. Maybe they talk to their spouse or partner at home, or maybe their friends online. Like the conversations are happening. It's just, they're not maybe happening in the workplace in a way that might be productive to like help people understand their behaviors, and how we can improve. And somebody asked me, I actually unintentionally said the word micro inclusion earlier because I was like focused on wanting to bring that up. But the opposite of a microaggression is a micro inclusion. And like, if we can shift from microaggressions, which would be, the CEO of a company, saying, hey guys, all the time, and start to use words like folks and team and crew and things that are much more inclusive, you start to create a more cohesive work environment where people feel included. And like, on the upswing of that is going to be higher retention and engagement and better participation and, innovation, right? So I think those are all really important, sort of concepts. And, when I think about other ways to, help offset microaggressions, Michael brought up this idea of like making sure that certain people's voices get heard. And, if we're looking for like tactical things that we can take back to our workplace, there's two that I'll suggest here. One is a little bit more explicit. It's called shine theory. If anyone's ever heard of it, it was sort of a concept that was originally coined by Amitav Sao and Anne Friedman as a way to sort of lift up the voices of, in particular, women in the workplace. And it's a really quick, read. If you Google shine theory, you'll find a couple quick articles about it. But it's the kind of thing you can send to people inside your workplace and say, hey, we should consider using this type of framework to make sure that we're elevating the voices of people that may not be seen and heard and represented because of things like microaggressions and unconscious bias. So I would say that that's a really nice little sort of tactic. And one thing, because I feel like there's a lot of like HR and recruiters and recruiting people that are responsible for like culture and hiring on this call. And there's one like little really subtle thing that I think you can do. And it's like on a job requisition, there's like all this technology now that like, it's great technology that can help like eradicate unconscious bias and, microaggressions in your language. But one of the things that people focus on is like just where would traditionally say like, the ideal candidate, blah, 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 like she, her, or sorry, he or she, right? He/she would be written in the sentence. People naturally think, well, we should just delete that, right? And what I'll tell you, if you want to create a little micro inclusion that like will really go a long way for a lot of people, is don't delete it, but put he, she, and then they, right? And like, if you do that, it really signals a consciousness in your organization. And it signals to people, not just trans people and gender non-conforming folks, but it signals to like the ecosystem around them, right? Like I have brothers and sisters and parents and, I have children, right? And when those people see those things, they'll gravitate towards that type of culture because they'll go, these people get it, right? Yeah. And I think those are the really kind of really cool thing about micro inclusions is that when you start practicing them on a regular basis, you're gonna see that people are just more drawn to your organization, to your culture, and it doesn't feel like just a policy or a statement that we made, but it's something that we practice and that we do and we're intentional about, and we own, like Michael was saying earlier, like we own it when we do it wrong, right? And like one other question real quick that came through was, I thought was really interesting. Somebody asked, had the employee that I used to touch her hair every day. If she had spoken up to me, 10 years ago, like what would I have done? And like, I wouldn't have been able to process it. Like I wouldn't have gotten it, right? Because I didn't have my own self-awareness and like concept of my own identity to be able to like process why that would be a big deal. So if she'd said something to me, I'm just being really honest, I probably would have like gotten angry about it. And I would have probably accused her of being too sensitive. Like I just wouldn't have gotten it. And so that's why like it's really important that while we're talking about microaggressions and unconscious bias, these are advanced concepts that like most people on the call are like conscious enough to like get on this call and be involved in it. But the people who are really like, doing this a lot are the people that they can't handle this conversation yet, right? So we have to like really start with a foundation of self-awareness and like understanding our own identity before we can start to understand the lived experiences and the nuances of like those around us that these things really matter for.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. I mean, only through exposure and more awareness do you even find the space to evolve from your thinking, right? You admit to 10 years ago not being able to process it, but 10 years later, you've had so many experiences and lived so many, so many experiences with different people, and that helps to change your awareness and your ability to process, these things that you might not have noticed even before. So that's an excellent point. Kia, I'd love to hear your point of view on.
Real quick on that. I'm sorry. The problem is that most people can't go through the experience I just went through.
True.
Right?
That is, yeah.
So all these people in positions of power like aren't going to go through this. They're going to continue navigating spaces with that same power dynamic that they have today. And they're just like, nothing's broken here. Like, why would I change, right? And that person was being too sensitive and it's another one to throw off the ship. And so that's why we really have to like focus on helping those people go through this journey, but in a way that is not just throwing them into a conversation like this, which is oftentimes will sound like a list of things that they can't do.
Right.
Right. And they're going to reject that.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of there's a more subtle way to get at that. And that, again, always goes back to self-awareness. And that's a whole series of exercises. But anyways, sorry to cut that off. But
no, it's great. Great. Kia?
Yeah, to me, I think I say this all the time. We are challenging, influencing, correcting dinner table conversations that people may have had for 20, 30, 40, 50 or more years of their life, and expecting that they will behave differently in a work environment where they've never been expected to before in many instances. And so it is absolutely a journey. Certainly from a societal perspective, but absolutely from a work perspective as well. And the work environment just mirrors what you see in society. One of the things that I also often talk with leaders about is as a CEO or as a business leader, you have the ability and you have the responsibility of creating the culture that you do or do not want to continue to invest in the organization that you're responsible for. And so I think I have a counter perspective to Natalie's point of HR is not necessarily responsible for the culture. It's really the accountability of that business leader and the people that they've hired in their organization to create a culture where everyone can thrive and everyone has the opportunity to really be their best and feel a sense of belonging. And I absolutely agree. I think awareness, education is where it starts. If you don't know the phrase microaggression because you're come from a place of privilege and you've never experienced one, how can we expect that you're going to identify these things and then correct your behavior? So the awareness and the education is key. I think setting expectations in an organization is also something that I work with leaders a lot on. What is the expectation around behavior? And so when a microaggression or something more severe pops up in terms of behavior or comments, how are you going to address those? And how do you make it very clear what's acceptable and not in terms of how we treat one another at work? The other thing is examining and also shifting people processes and work norms. So what are the underlying systemic processes around how people are promoted, how people's performance ratings are attributed to them, how we assign work projects. Are you giving the D&I project only to the Black person in the organization? Are you putting the expectation that shifting culture sits with someone where it actually does not belong there? And so those are some of the ways as well. The other thing in terms of training, education, accountability, all of those, the other thing is that there are populations of employees every day who are experiencing this harm. And so what's the care and support that an organization is providing for their employees that are experiencing these things? And there are lots of internal companies that internally provide resources and support, and then also partner with external organizations, EAP programs. There's an amazing organization that's Philadelphia-based, the Ladipo Group, and they do a lot of work with trauma. They have worked with victims of 9/11, and they are doing a tremendous amount of work today with organizations, with individuals, at a macro and micro level to help support people in the moment that we're in today and how they're living through that with racism, continued police brutality, the murders of Black and brown people that continue to persist. And they are helping from a trauma perspective to come into organizations. There are other groups. There's a great friend and colleague of mine, Suki Sandhu, out of London, who has an organization called Involve. He's amazing in terms of the work that they do with organizations to help them. So for any company that may be struggling or having a difficult time with where to start or what to do, there are lots of partnerships. I mean, Natalie, Michael, the work that the two of you do, again, lots of experts in a variety of fields to be able to help all around the world with some of this. But it really starts with the senior leaders, the level of accountability, awareness, education, expectation setting, and then the support that they openly will provide, as well as role modeling. There are, especially now, many leaders who have had to accept that they have made missteps and mistakes, own that publicly, and then correct. And those are the leaders that I see in their journey saying, listen, none of us are perfect. I didn't get this right, but someone gave me feedback and I appreciate that. So thank you. And here's what I will be doing differently. And I think it goes beyond all of the CEOs and leaders sending an email today saying we support Black Lives Matter. Great, that's one step. But the reality is, what are you actually doing to show different improvements to advance Black, brown, women, marginalized groups through your organization? What are you doing to ensure that internally and externally, you, because you do hold power and privilege, are leveraging that in a way that will change society? And I often will ask leaders, what side of history do you want to be on? When this movement, we're looking back at this next year, 5 years, decades from now, what side of this do you really want to be on as a person that had the ability to enact change?
Yeah, that's an incredibly powerful question. And, I would imagine that everyone wants to be on the right side of that history. But to your point, Natalie, earlier, if you don't think anything's broken, then why would you want to make any sort of change? You said something really interesting earlier, Kia, about HR not being responsible for culture. Can you talk a little bit as an HR leader about your perspective on hiring for cultural fit versus whatever other options you might have? I like to think of it as a cultural ad, to your point, people who are going to be role models. But can you talk a little bit about what your approach to that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the HR professionals have an obligation to help influence and shape, but the accountability for the culture that is being built and the culture that we live in rests with business leaders. Absolutely, I think you hit the nail on the head, Melinda, in terms of Culture Ad. It's actually a program that we have internally with my current organization. And so we look at not who's fitting into our organization when we're interviewing, but we look at who's going to add to our culture. And that means that you understand the culture that you're trying to build, and it's one that resonates with your employees. I think where you have a company that the employee voice is heard and respected. Now you may get you'll certainly get diversity in terms of what those voices are, but there's a combination and there's a partnership between the vision that the CEO sets and the expectations that your employee base share as well, and how you marry those to then define and drive the culture that you're looking for. I think collectively everyone has a part to play in building that culture. And absolutely making sure that you are listening, you're engaging, you're connecting with employees, that employees feel connected to the work that they're doing and connected to one another in a meaningful way. To do that though, there needs to be a sense of belonging, and that I feel respected and valued and heard and seen. And so that's all the other work that leaders need to be doing to ensure that this is a place where that can happen. And then you can get to the opposite end of where everyone's sort of like, you know, hugging and singing. But the reality is we're so far away from that in almost every organization. I keep saying it's a journey, but you've got to continue to make those steps towards what you really desire and what people really deserve and should have in an organization that they come to work for every day, that there's belonging. You don't have to agree on everything. That's the beauty as well. You don't have to agree on everything, but we should be aligned on key principles. We should be aligned on key values. And if you're not bought into that, then organizations need to be able to say you're no longer welcome to be here, because this is not the organization that we're trying to create. This is the one that we are, which is inclusive and value of the addition to our culture.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's up to the organizations to actually make those bold moves, to be able to say you're not culturally a contributor here. You may do good work and their output may be good, but your contribution culturally isn't quite aligned with what we envision ourselves to be, and that's a tough move for a lot of organizational leaders to make. I would imagine.
Yeah, I think, you know, as you're hiring people as well, there are very simple things that organizations can do, unbiasing your job descriptions. So as Natalie shared with the pronouns, there's other language that can be in a job description that will deter someone from applying. So for a sales role, for example, aggressive, words like aggressive, things that may actually have someone who's a woman decide, well, that's not quite the role for me, or someone who's looking at other language in a description that makes them feel like, well, I can't really lean into that. That's not really me stylistically. It has nothing to do with what you need people to achieve in the role. That's all about the style and the way you want them to do it. And so taking that language out of job descriptions is one way. I think the other thing as well is when you're interviewing, having diverse interview panels. So ensuring that there is a diversity of perspective, of background, of culture in the interview panel when you're selecting and hiring people as well, and that those people feel empowered and are capable of being transparent with their feedback, and that you hold one another accountable for the language that you're using. Are we using biased language as we think about this particular candidate, that he or she was emotional, you know, again, emotional, those kinds of terms that we use to attribute negative behavior, you know, and bias to a particular gender or race of people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Michael, I want to give you a minute to respond to the question, and then I want to open it up to the polling question to the audience, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you. Wow, there was so much good stuff there. I actually just kind of want to respond to some of that. So I think I can wrap it all in my responding to some of that and answering the question in the same context. So to Natalie's point brilliantly about like this idea, people need safe space to actually, and this is going to sound kind of weird, but go with me. People need safe enough space to be harmful, just not around the people it would harm. You get what I'm saying?
Okay.
Certain things have to come out of the mouth
yeah.
to then be addressed and then be reorganized. So for an example, there are white people that need to vocalize certain things in front of other white people that do not necessarily agree with them about Black people or migrants or whatever issue. But the Black people and the migrants do not need to be in the room while that's going on. And or a person like me, I've been trained to be in those situations. So I might take on the responsibility to be in that moment and be facilitating a group like that. But even then it's like at the right time, because people, this is the tricky part with conscious bias, political correctness. Oh, if I say X or Y, and this is how I really feel, I'm going to be labeled A or B. So I'm just not going to say it. I will operationalize it, but I'm not going to say it so nobody can ever call me on it. So there is this thing about having safe groups for people to come together with other folks that might identify with them but don't have the same ideology as them. And that's where some interesting work can take place, right? And I think those kinds of groups are necessary. It can get scary for people though, because I know in workplaces, people get upset about the idea that the Black employees want to have a Black group to talk about their experiences. They're like, well, it's got to be inclusive and et cetera. And so what I often phrase back to people is, would you force women who want to talk about maybe issues of aggression from men, would you force them to be in a room with men to talk about that? Would you feel comfortable with that? So many people go like, no, and I'm like, yeah, same kind of parallel, right? People who identify in a particular group need safe space to be with other people that look like them or identify in whatever way that identity moniker is working. They need safe space for that to work out or talk things out or whatever, right? And it's up to that group or those people to figure that thing out, and people should be afforded that space. And then after that work, then could come together with people outside of that group to do the next level up of dialogue, right? And so I think that's one level of importance in this combo. It's like, you got to make it safe enough for people to bumble around and be harmful again, but without the people who would be harmed being present, right? Because you don't have the right to harm other people, right? But being human is messy, and I get it. So how do we best organize for that? Second quick point is that I believe in business case and rationale, right? With them, what's in it for me? So when I'm talking to business executives about their organizational culture, and I love that Kia brought up trauma, I start there. I start with the science of our humanity. I start with the science of suffering, looking at trauma and chronic stress, because one of the core definitions of trauma is that it is a perceived or literal threat, emotionally or physically, to someone's well-being that is going to elicit feelings of terror, helplessness, powerlessness, and a lack of control. Everything we talked about today, we can at least check off 3 out of those 4. And if microaggressions are happening all willy-nilly, people are experiencing trauma in the workplace. And there is a great body of literature on what happens to individuals and systems when they are constantly berated and barraged by traumatic experiences. And by default, then chronic stressors, because the stress mechanism in the body is not built to be activated for more than 20 to 30 minute spurts. Anything over that becomes poisonous to the body. It actually can erode brain architecture. It can disrupt skill recall. There's really interesting work from an organizational psychologist named Pamela Smith, who's worked at a bunch of the big business schools looking at this phenomenon around how does perceptions of powerlessness connected to core places of personal identity disrupt executive function. And what they found is it can dramatically disrupt skill recall. These are skills people already have that they've already mastered or have a good handle on. They get disrupted in the moment where they're needed based on outside activation or internalized activation of an idea that someone might be leveraging a stereotype against them, microaggressions being present in the place or space, also just primers of things on the wall even that might remind maybe a woman, right? That there's this idea that she shouldn't be good at math or she's not good at math, right? All those things have a physiological and emotional and cognitive impact on the body in the context of performance. There's also a huge body of literature around stress in the workplace in general. People are losing about 10 to 15 hours of good work time from employees weekly because of financial woes, and it's a difference between absenteeism versus presenteeism. So there are all these ways that there's data points and knowledge out there that just has to be collected and then put together for the executive to read and go, listen, I don't even need you to understand the Black people's plight. I don't need you to understand the trans folks' plight. What I need you to understand from this context is that your unhealthy environment for them is actually costing you. So your best bet, make it healthy for them and your profit margins will go up, point blank. Whether or not you become unracist, unhomophobic, like I actually kind of don't care. The goal at this point is for you to create the healthy work environments for your employees so they can thrive. Because if the science of trauma and chronic stress is the science of suffering, then the flip side is that the science of thriving and human flourishing is just as valid. It has inputs and we can organize ourselves around that to address that. But we do have to be careful of some of this like car salesman DEI stuff, which has us like starting at step 3 as opposed to step 1 or even step 0.
You've given us a ton to think about. I'm actually going to skip the poll question and let's go to the audience questions because we're just past the 12 o'clock hour and I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask their questions. So let's go to the chat. We have, so we touched upon the micro inclusions question for Natalie. Let's see, Michael, I have heard recently that diversity and inclusion are attempts at equality regarding the inputs into a system, and equity is equality at the outcomes of a system. In this context, would that mean raising awareness and actions around implicit bias, D&I, that eventually microaggressions will decrease? Do you have a point of view on that from Christopher?
Can you read that one more time? I was trying to.
Yeah, that was a bit of a mouthful. I have heard recently that diversity and inclusion are attempts at equality regarding the inputs into a system, and equity is equality at the outputs of a system. In this context, would that mean raising awareness and actions around implicit bias that eventually microaggressions will decrease?
Okay, got you. Interesting framing. I can't say I agree or disagree with the premise. I would want to sit, I'm a thinker. I'd want to sit with it a bit more, but I get where with the context of inputs and outputs are looking at, but so here's how I tend to think about these things. If we can't state what our values clearly are, and then map those values to budget line items and to policies, procedures, and practices within the organization, then we just got a lot of talking, right? These things should not be ethereal or ephemeral. They should not be nebulous. It should be very clear. Yes, we do. No, we don't. And kind of point blank, right? And so I think about equity not necessarily as an output, but equity is the frame, and then the activity that needs to match it needs to be like lockstep, right? And so equality is a bit of a trick to me. Like equality, we all get $2, but I'm starting with negative $75 and Melinda has $250. So that $2, that equal measure, that's not helpful for me in that moment. I am $2 richer than I was before, but it's effectively not doing much for me. And the way that that $2 is operationalized in our personal lives or in the context of problem solving in our lives, just for the survival index that we all have to go through as human beings, you know, Melinda and I are in two very different spaces with those $2. And so that's the tricky part about equality versus equity, et cetera. So that's why I offer, like, part of the frame switch is if we were to focus on one, what is the education around human suffering that we need to understand? And then how do issues like identity, race, gender, et cetera, complicate that or make it even more palpable in the workplace, home, school systems, et cetera. And then the flip side is, what are the inputs for human flourishing? What are the inputs for human well-being, taking into context those same kind of dimensionalities around identity? And then once you begin to sit in that tension and reflect on, what does my system do? What are our cultural practices? And that's informal and formal culture. So informal culture, I also say formal and informal policy. Formal policies are things that are written down, legislated, the whole night. It's in the employee handbook, it's documented. The informal stuff, the best example or the clearest example I can give you in this moment is unequal pay for women. Well documented in terms of research data, not documented in anyone's like policy or procedural handbook, but widely practiced. And we know, so it's also a form of conscious bias at play, right? So informal policy, informal practice, or informal culture and formal culture, we have to sit between the tension of the science of suffering, the science of flourishing, and go, where are our inputs headed? Which direction do they go? Are our line items in our budget pushing towards flourishing or pushing towards suffering? Policies, procedures, practices, same nine, or same deal. And then from there, you know, now it's not so nebulous. We don't have to sit and like, do we all have the same definitions? It's just intentionality versus harm. And we can be very clear on that.
Okay. Does anybody else have a point of view on that question?
think Michael did a really good job with it. So,
so I have another question from the viewer for Kia. What are the recommendations you have for a worker when the worker gives visibility to a specific act or series of acts of microaggressions from a peer or direct leader, and the leader or peer is not receptive to the feedback? They deny there's a problem in their behavior, or they just don't see it problematic. What should the worker do at this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. In addition to sort of leading HR with one of our businesses in my organization, I also lead our DEI strategy with our executives for my part of the organization. And so, I mean, this is a really real example that comes up in organizations all of the time. I think it's important to understand the reality of, first, it takes courage for someone to say, hey, what you said or did hurt me in a particular way, or may have caused harm to someone else as I've observed it. So that takes courage, and I think acknowledging that is important. But also there's a reality that because you bring this feedback forward doesn't mean that you're going to get the response that you would like from the person. So some people are really ignorant to their behavior. Some people are unaware and also unaccepting, which is what this question gets to the heart of. I think it's also important to separate who someone is from what they've done. And so when you're giving feedback, I don't actually care who you are. I want to talk about what you've done and how it has landed with me, how I've experienced that harm or that microaggression from what you've done. And sometimes that enables people to hear the feedback differently. So you don't get into this back and forth about who I am as a human being or as an individual. We talk about the behavior and how I've experienced that. I think the other piece of it is, depending on the severity, if it's something that's very serious or persistent, that's something that you might want to raise to someone even more senior, a member of HR. Most organizations also have a third party line that you can call or a group that you can access to raise issues around integrity or ethics. That's another route that you could take. I think the other thing is there will absolutely be microaggressions that people experience that you decide to let go because it's not worth your energy. There will be microaggressions that you bring up to people that they don't acknowledge. Again, that's unfortunate on their end because it is a missed opportunity for them to grow and to develop as a human being. I also think that it depends on what the experience is. If it's something that's going to continue to chip away at the way that you work, continues to degrade your confidence in the organization, there are other routes that you'll have to take in terms of escalating that particular issue, because that behavior is something that will need to stop in order for you to continue to thrive and participate at work as an employee should be able to do. But I do think there is a reality that sometimes you address people with things and they just don't see it, they don't acknowledge it, they're not willing to. What is really helpful is when you're not alone in raising that awareness for people or trying to. And so where peers and colleagues can step in and say a number of things, or a number of ways where a peer or colleague can observe this behavior from an individual and say, you know, what you just said constitutes a microaggression. We don't do that here. Or it can be something, you know, from an educational perspective where they say, you know, the words that you've used to describe that particular project actually have a harmful historical past. Let's describe it in this way instead. So everything doesn't have to really call someone out in a way that embarrasses them or is super aggressive in return. I think you should match, the energy should match. So the level of depth and harm that can come from the microaggression, I would sort of match the reaction with that, whether or not you escalate it in a more formal channel, or it's addressed sort of one-on-one separately, or it's something that you can quickly address in a group setting for everyone to hear and acknowledge and move on from, I think is important, but certainly not an easy question. And it can be even more hurtful when you bring something to someone that you've gathered the courage to do, and they don't respond in a way that you would like for them to, out of mutual respect, to say, I hear you, I acknowledge that, and I will change my behavior and do better. Thank you is usually what people want to hear, but that's not always the case.
Right, right. I want to move on to a question from the audience. Natalie, I'd like to give you an opportunity to touch on this. Zoe asked, can you touch on how some cultures can be more tolerant and not always recognize the aggression for what it is? Can you talk a little bit about that?
And I think that it's sort of, just to piggyback a little bit off the last question, I think that, you know, as Kia said, a lot of the stuff I would have said, you know, you have to kind of pick your battles, unfortunately. Like, it would be great if we could all just like stand up for ourselves and fight the good fight. But I would just recommend that, like, oftentimes, like, you know, and for survival reasons, oftentimes we can't, right? And like, that's like a part of privilege, is that some people have the privilege to be able to have those conversations and some people don't. But there are real frameworks to be able to have those conversations. And I think Kia hit a lot of the major ways to do that. But in terms of, you know, sort of making the organization more, you know, accepting, you know, I don't want to use the word tolerant because no one wants to be tolerated, but to really make it more accepting and inclusive where people feel like they belong. I think, you know, the number one thing that I see is that it has to start from the top. Right. And I think Michael hit on a lot of this earlier, like the WIFM, like if the CEO and the board of directors, like, can't tell you why, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, you know, matter, then, you know, the initiatives, the efforts, the little opportunities are not going to go anywhere. Right. It's really an unfortunate thing. And I think we get really focused on DEI, or, you know, whatever acronym we want to use for it, but it's really about culture. It's like about culture change. And, you know, I think of DEI as like tactics to change culture. And when an organization doesn't have buy-in from the top, like, again, like, I mean, I said, like, these initiatives are just not going to go anywhere. And Michael brought up a point earlier that I wanted to piggyback on, so I'll use this opportunity here. It might have been Kia as well, but, you know, when an organization doesn't have somebody whose sole job is focus, you know, whatever their title ends up being, chief diversity officer, chief culture officer, if there's not somebody whose full-time job is focused on that, then the CEO is that person. And a lot of times the CEO is like, whoa, I didn't sign up for that job, right? Like, I'm not doing that. But it's kind of, if you look at like a startup or just any company from its like early days, you know, the CEO does do everything and they're setting the tone for the culture. And if they're not, you know, creating programmatic, you know, systematic, institutionalized ways for people to give feedback and receive feedback, because there's an art on both sides. There's giving feedback and then there's receiving feedback. And a lot of times, you know, just to kind of, something I was going to talk about, the conversation that Kia or the question that Kia was answering is like, a lot of times, like, you got to give that feedback in the right way at the right time. Right. And it's not always in the moment. Right. So just because you experienced the microaggression does that mean like that's the time to respond to it? And again, that's why there's frameworks around like the appropriate way to give feedback. And there's also frameworks around the appropriate way to receive feedback. And oftentimes those are really missing ingredients inside organizations. And, you know, what's really frustrating is that if, you know, a group of really passionate or people inside of an organization feel compelled to do some initiatives around this, they ultimately won't have legs, they won't last, they won't be sustainable and scalable and repeatable until it's coming from the top. And, you know, if you think about putting in processes around any part of the organization, you know, whether it's marketing or product development or customer service, there's always processes and there's lots and lots of training, right? We don't take it for granted, right? We do it anyways. We always have these trainings in place. And, you know, I think we're just waking up organizationally and culturally to the fact that like we have to do the same thing around culture. And, you know, it's challenging. As Michael said earlier, it's messy, right? Like, it's not easy when humans are involved and we have all these different experiences coming together, and there's employee churn and there's all these factors that we don't have to deal with other parts of our systems. So we're just at the sort of very beginning of taking the black box of culture that was traditionally something we can't do anything about, right? We just accept the fact that we have this turnover. We accept that we have, all these isms inside of our organization, and we just can't afford it anymore. So people are starting to put these processes in. We're starting to become woke. I think that technology is going to play a big role of that. Like, not to sort of shamelessly plug what we're doing, but we're building technology to help companies, institutionalize these efforts, right? And that's the only way that we're going to be able to scale it, because again, these efforts that ERGs and really passionate leaders in certain parts of the organization, they're not going to scale if we don't have systems around it. And that to me is how we're going to move forward. Is we've got to have buy-in from the top, and we have to have systems and in this particular case technology that helps us drive this forward. And there's so much great activity. As an entrepreneur in the space, I'm so optimistic and excited about all of the innovation that's happening in the space right now, to help us get to where we need to go.
Mm-hmm. Great, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I do have another question I want to ask, and I'm going to ask it, and then I'm going to put your contact information up on the screen to share it with the audience members while you're thinking or answering the question. So the question from Quentin is, how do you feel about the expectation of disclosure? I feel there is an expectation for those not considered part of the heteronormative culture to constantly come out of the closet. Who wants to take on that question?
I mean, I'll quickly say something. I'd love to hear from all three of us, but like there's a certain element of privilege in not having to disclose, right? I mean, like, as soon as I open my mouth, like, I'm disclosing my identity, right? I said it earlier, because that was part of our intro, but like, people immediately recognize me as trans, like, and I think the concept of passing is a really like slippery slope. It's a very problematic issue, and there's all kinds of constructs that psychologically make trans people feel like they have to pass. And because it's something I would like, I actually aspire to pass in many situations. Like, not all trans people do, by the way. I put a lot of effort into that, and I pass most of the time until I open my mouth. And so I have to come out every day. And I think that like disclosure is good, but to a degree, right? Because it can become harmful as well. I see a lot of organizations like being like, oh, I just read this article, or I saw this thing, and everybody should put their pronouns on their emails, right? Everybody should disclose. And like, that actually can be really highly problematic, right? Like, forcing people to disclose that or publish something like in that capacity, could be they're not ready for it. And, even though they might identify as cis and, they feel their pronouns align with their identity, like, they may not be ready for it. And again, that can be a little bit problematic, right? Because everybody's on their own journey, and, it can cause tension and disengagement. And like, that's a whole nother conversation. But the biggest problem I've seen is that you're forcing people who might be gender nonconforming and or trans, but not out, to then out themselves, right? Or to awkwardly put, like, if I had worked for a company that said, you need to do this like 5 years ago, and I was struggling with my identity, but I wasn't out, I would have to have put he, him pronouns so that I assimilate and look like everybody else. So I think that's like a really awkward thing to do, is forced disclosure. And there's really great ways to do it that don't make that awkward situation. And like, self-ID is one of those. Like, self-ID is a really, really, I think really powerful exercise and tool inside of organizations that can be done really poorly. And I think one of the things that people do is they force people to disclose these answers. And I actually, just to kind of give you a little consulting here, I think it's okay to force people to answer the questions, but you have to give them the option to choose not to disclose, right? So if you're gonna do a self-ID project as part of like an annual update of everybody updating their information, and you wanna strategically pick out 5 questions that you're gonna have people answer about their identity, you can ask them to just, you can force them to answer the question, but you can give them the option whether or not they want to answer it. So they can choose not to disclose, but they had to answer the question, right? So at least you're giving them the level of anonymity, whatever, so that they can, continue to be comfortable in a way that drives value.
Yeah. Michael, do you want to take a minute to address that question?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just saw a comment pop up that I think kind of dovetails with this around, yeah, so there's a lot of personal stuff to someone's last comment, but work is personal. Work is tied to your wages, which are tied to every way that you can sustain your family, sustain your livelihood, solve problems in your life, take care of your health. We're talking a lot right now in the country around like racism as a public health issue. So in this idea of like the social determinants of health come up. And I always challenge people to think about show me the way that your wages and the income you make are not in any way attached to how these social determinants are taking shape or operationalizing in your life. So work has always been this personal. We've just turned a blind eye to it. Our humanity being shared amongst each other, and the fact that as a species, we're social organisms, which means that our relationships with one another are wholly tied into how our physiology and biology works, therefore how our psychology and cognition works. In terms of development, actually in developmental science, we talk about humanity developing in 4 different dimensions at the same time: the biological, psychological, social, and the 4th dimension is spiritual. The spiritual is not religion, it's meaning making, because we as social creatures that use language and not just verbal language, to Natalie's point earlier, other ways to communicate. We make meaning out of everything. You make meaning out of literally everything. And a lot of meaning is also inherited if you think about metaculture, advertising, the whole 9, but then also like family culture, family history. So development is a part of every aspect of the life trajectory. And it's interesting because economic theory and political economy try to make this idea that like market forces are these abstract things that don't have these human inputs. And that's all just not true. And where we stand at now in the 21st century is this reckoning around whether or not the personal stuff that is inherently in any social space that humans are in, and some of the most complex spaces we have are the ones tied to economic markets, where you have varying conflated needs and identities bumbling into each other to try to solve an issue like getting a thing to market to drive profit. That's really complex human behavior on top of each other. We either are going to admit that it is that personal or we're not, and we deal with all the aftermath, right? And so even in this context of thinking about disclosure, if you want your profit margins to be high, you can't have a lot of shame running around your organization. Point blank. And the flip side is, the organizations that have some of the biggest profit margins, even if we don't necessarily agree with their tactics around like what they're selling or if it's hurting the environment, et cetera, I allow all the space for those conversations and for people to make those ethical calls, because that's a part of this work in our journey as trying to figure out what's best for shared humanity, right? I think the flip side is, when you look at those companies, there are a lot of things that they're doing, at least for like middle management up, that are really humanist, really kind, really caring. They might not just be sharing it with the whole organization though, right? But there is this idea, and I bring this up because it's not that we don't know what to do in many cases, we're just not doing it for everybody. Right? And that doesn't mean we have it all figured out. We do got a lot of spaces to figure this out, but even in the context of disclosure, there are things that folks would never require a C-suite to disclose, or the staffing that reports right to C-suite and senior management. They would never have to do those things. They can be suffering from addiction, and they're going to get a ton of services to help them, get through that issue that might not be available to anyone on the bottom half of the company, right? In terms of hierarchy. So again, it's not that we don't know what to do. It's just whether or not we're going to democratize the accessibility to the procedures, operations, and budgets that support human well-being for the company and for the people that are there.
Thank you, Michael. I think that we've covered a lot in this period of time. We're coming up on the 90-minute mark. I do want to give each of you an opportunity to make some closing statements here. And I want to apologize if we were not able to address any specific questions from the audience, but I do feel like we covered a lot of ground here. So I want to thank you for sharing and for your vulnerable moments, and you've taught me a lot, that is for sure. So Kia, why don't you give us your closing statement.
Sure. So first, I mean, I'm just grateful that the opportunity to have these discussions is continuing. And so appreciative of Juno for bringing us together with all of you, really to have such an important discussion for people who are involved in influencing what happens in organizations and also what happens in society. I think it's just super critical that we continue to educate, learn, and influence. I would also say, you know, find ways as an individual to speak up on behalf of others and to call things out to the extent that you have the energy and you are capable of doing so. But don't feel like if you are a member of a marginalized group that that burden needs to be solely on your shoulders. We've talked a lot about organizations. We talked a lot about the relationships with people in organizations. One thing we didn't get to touch on, Melinda, was customers. And so when you work in an environment where your employees are subjected to microaggressions or other behavior from customers, and thinking about that lens of the impact and the experience of an employee being end to end. And that is from the beginning of your interview process and your selection process when you're recruiting people, through to the interactions they have with people inside the organization and outside. Partners and customers don't get a pass either. If you really believe in the culture and the care and well-being of your employees, that also extends to people externally and how they are treated and how they interact there. And the accountability with leadership to change those dynamics on behalf of their employee population. There are so many companies now that are becoming woke, and we can get into a long debate about, you know, why it has taken all this time. But now companies are waking up to these things, some for genuine reasons, some more self-serving. But the reality is there is and there will continue to be, and I hope that there's going to be real change as a result of this. And so that means that just because you are ignorant or uneducated or unaware does not absolve you from the responsibility. And so all of us have the responsibility and an accountability for ourselves and to hold others accountable as well, internal to the organization, and again, external with anyone that your employees are interacting with.
Thank you. Natalie, you want to take a moment?
Yeah, thank you for this last moment. I appreciate it. And to everybody that's still on the call, thank you for sticking around. So I think Kia said a lot of what I probably would have said, you know, specifically around like allyship and sort of, you know, standing up on behalf of other people. I think as a trans person, it just gets exhausting standing up for myself all the time. And it's much more effective actually if somebody else intervenes quite often, and it's huge relief for me in all kinds of situations, whether I'm in a restaurant or I'm in a work environment, it doesn't matter. So just stepping in, when somebody misgenders me, it's really helpful if somebody else steps in and says, oh, you mean she, right? Like that just, it's, for some reason it sticks more when other people do. I don't know what that is, but my three key takeaways, I guess, if they're like hashtags, right? So we talked about language earlier. So like hashtag language matters, right? And I think just being really conscious about that is gonna be a really important thing for anybody on the call. I would also say hashtag representation matters, right? And I think that that's just, I think finally we're getting to a tipping point where like, hopefully that's just like the default for everything. But I think really being calculated about representation in workspaces and voices will be really critical moving forward. And then my last, just to tie it back to what we were talking about, is that allyship matters, right? Hashtag allyship matters. And, you know, people can be nuanced and say, you know, allyship isn't enough. You know, it needs to be, you know, there's another version of that word. But I think that, you know, being an ally is not just being a fan, right? Like a lot of times, like if I asked everybody to like raise your hand and say like, raise your hand if you're an ally to like Black people or an ally to trans people, like I can guarantee you like almost everybody would raise their hands. But actually like doing something and like you can't call yourself an ally, right? Like you're an ally because you're an ally because of your actions in the moment. And, you know, I can call you an ally to the trans community. It's very hard to call yourself an ally if you're not actively out doing things and stepping in and where it's appropriate, right? I mean, oftentimes safety and things like that can be an issue, but I would say allyship matters. Those are my three key takeaways: is language matters, representation matters, and allyship matters.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I would say, one, it's impossible to know all your biases, though you should do an in-depth journey to name them. Two, because it's impossible to know all your biases, really look up and read on debiasing techniques to really begin to think about, how do I attend to the blind spots? What are some techniques for that individually, collectively, as a group or system? Because the blind spots are still your responsibility. And what a tricky responsibility. They're blind spots. You don't know exactly what they are, but we still got to own up and do the work. Third thing I would say is to this comment or question around resilience or self-care. So important. So from a humanist, I consider myself a humanist. And from a humanist perspective, I think about rights that sometimes I don't know that other people think about. And because I dig in anthropology and developmental science and organizational psych and et cetera, these things really matter to me. So I think every human has the right to experiences of joy, awe, and wonder. And I heard it said at a conference by a brilliant woman whose name I can't remember, and I've been searching for the last 3 years. But this woman said, it is your responsibility to schedule moments of joy and celebration and awe and wonder in your life, because trauma and grief schedule itself. Never has that a comment smacked me in my face the way that one did. I said, wow, that is so real. That it is actually our job to make sure that we are attending to our real needs and inputs for joy, awe, and wonder. So over COVID-19, 2 of my friends and I routinely would go to the beach and put our feet in the water at night when nobody's around and we're looking at the stars and the moon, and it's just us. And we have a great time. And then I come back home. I routinely walk by the river. I take meetings by the river. I'll walk with my iPad by the river, by the Schuylkill for 3 hours in the middle of the day, taking my meetings, staying away from people as much as possible, because that helps me be able to be in this fight and remember that life has so much more to give than just the fight, right? Though the fight is necessary and allyship is necessary. So attending to yourself is the last point I would say.
Yeah, that is, that's a really great note to end this conversation on. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This has been really an amazing conversation and a fantastic learning experience. I'm so honored to have met you all. And I really hope that we can do this again, because I think there's so much more to talk about and so much more to learn. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It was a great meeting, everyone.
You too. Take care.
Everyone.
Have a great weekend if you keep track of time.
Yeah.